My top 10 heavyweight rankings at the end of 24. Well, I'm going to say up front that there are a few fighters in this list who may be removed from the top 10, but we'll double back to that. So we'll start with number 10, and this is one of those fighters who perhaps shouldn't really be in the top 10 anymore, but that is Joe Joyce. So the way I do my rankings is if somebody loses, I don't bump them all the way down to the bottom of the list type thing. They simply switch places if somebody else was ranked higher than them or lower than them. So because Joe Joyce lost to Derek Chisora, I feel that he has to be ranked lower than Chisora. However, Joe Joyce showed me in that matchup with Chisora that he's a little bit shot. Hard to know. We have to give him perhaps one more chance. In a sense, that's up to Joe Joyce and Team Joyce to see if they can kind of rejuvenate him technically as a fighter and perhaps mentally as a fighter as well. But for the time being, out of respect for what he's contributed and the fact that he just lost to somebody else who I put in the top 10, I don't think I can bounce Joe Joyce out of the top 10. But I will double back to that at the end of this. So in number 9, as you may have guessed, I have Derek Chisora. Now, he looked really great in that matchup versus Joe Joyce. So I feel that Derek Chisora deserves that spot at number 9. He earned it. Now, he's also announced that he's really only going to have a couple more fights, and then he's done like dinner, right? So I think he hinted that he wanted one more fight in the UK and then a fight in Africa, and then he's out of here. But we'll see what Del Boy decides to do. He did look sort of as a new and improved in his match with Joe Joyce. So I look forward to seeing what Derek Chisora does next. Now, in number 8, I have Ajit Kabayel. Now, here's the interesting thing for me was the fact that at the beginning of the year, I was really not a Kabayel fan. I was critical of his footwork in the ring and just his sort of lack of ring generalmanship, in my opinion. However, to his credit, Kabayel has kind of corrected that footwork issue of, crossing his feet, and he looked terrific in his last outing. So I feel, I'm happy to have him sort of move up in my opinion and also in the rankings. I have Ajit Kabayel at number 8. Now at number 7, I was very happy to have Martin Bakole. Yay, Martin Bakole got rid of Jared Anderson for us. Jared Anderson is definitely not in my top 10. In a way, I do feel a little badly for him because he really did take some damage versus Bakole in that fight. And I feel that his own promoter basically lied to him in the change room after by saying, we'll make this as if it never happened. And it's like, Bob Arum, you can't do that. You can't unwind what just happened. You can't undo the damage your fighter just took. And so I almost feel that by Bob Arum being so reassuring that he's in fact saying the exact opposite, which is, Jared, you're done. I'm not dealing with you anymore. So that's why Jared Anderson, well, that's not why, but in overall, no, Jared Anderson is not in my top 10. Now, I look forward to seeing what Martin Bakole does next. What a fantastic performance he put on versus Anderson. Anderson just didn't have a chance. Bakole not only outpowered him, but he dealt with Anderson's so-called slick movement. He was more technical than it looks like. I think people just see Bakole as this one-punch powerful fighter, and yet Bakole is technically sound. He's not a slick heavyweight, but look, heavyweights aren't made to be slick. I believe it was George Foreman that has said, at a certain point, a heavyweight has to fight like a heavyweight. Heavyweights fight differently than any other weight division in boxing. And Martin Bakole most definitely fights like a heavyweight. So I really look forward to seeing more from Bakole. I think he can work his way up into the top 5 and then vie for a title shot. I hope we're able to see that perhaps in 2025 or from 25 to 26. Now in the number 5 spot, I have Zhili Zhang. Now, prior to this ranking, I did have Zhang rated a little bit higher, but given the fact that he lost to Parker by decision, we have to put Joseph Parker in the number 5 slot ahead of Zhili Zhang, who drops to number 6. Now, that's not really I don't think that really takes a heck of a lot of shine off of Zhili Zhang's stature, certainly not with Zhang's KO victory over Wilder. Now, of note, Wilder is nowhere to be seen in my top 10 rankings. I wouldn't even put him in the top 20 at this point because he is most definitely done like dinner. He was done after the Parker fight and most certainly after the Wilder fight. If he wants an incredibly gratuitous farewell fight, then go for it. You know, Wilder, you know, Deontay has enough money that he could pay for his own farewell fight and throw a gala event for all his friends and family and then sail off into the sunset. Or he could just announce his retirement. It's kind of up to him. But yes, Deontay Wilder is nowhere to be seen in my top 10 rankings for sure. So in the number 4 slot, and again, this is one that's a little bit of a placeholder. In number 4, I have Anthony Joshua. Now I say a bit of a placeholder because I also feel that Anthony Joshua is done like dinner. If you look at his fight versus Dubois, Anthony just showed several habits that really kind of scare me because they're habits I wouldn't even tolerate from somebody who told me they wanted to make their amateur debut. So you can check out my post-fight breakdown of AJ versus Dubois for a little more specifics on that. But nevertheless, I don't think I can just arbitrarily remove Anthony Joshua from the top 10 rankings since he was formerly ranked number 3. However, I don't want to see him fight again. We do need a reason, though, to actually get him out of the top 10, meaning he either has to lose to somebody else in that top 10 or somebody even below the top 10, or AJ has to simply announce that he's done. So now in the number 3 slot, I'm very happy to say we have Daniel Dubois kind of jumped up in the top 10 heavyweight rankings in 2024, and more power to him because he simply kind of rebuilt himself, I think, post Usyk, and really focus on developing himself in terms of how he fights tactically, the technical parts of his game. Dubois also pointed to the fact that he has terrific support from his father, very vocal Dubois père, who you can see in the corner being quite animated. Now, in many cases, I think a lot of folks would say you shouldn't have the dad around like that, but it seems to work for Daniel Dubois. So more power to the father-son team. And I certainly look forward to the Dubois-Joseph Parker matchup. Regardless of who prevails, I think both men could sort of work their way into a title shot contention. Dubois, of course, called out Usyk post Usyk Fury 2. And in a sense, Dubois does have a wonderful argument for trying to secure that rematch with Usyk after he fights Parker. Regardless of whether he wins or loses in that matchup with Parker, I think Dubois has a solid argument for Dubois-Usyk or Usyk-Dubois. Now, in the number 2 slot, this may be somewhat controversial, but I'm going to leave Tyson Fury there, simply because even though he's lost twice to Usyk now, I don't feel like I can bounce him all the way down in the rankings. Somebody needs to defeat Fury in order to get Fury to drop below the second ranking. I don't base rankings on what I feel some fighters' abilities are. I base the rankings solely on, performance in the ring and who beats who. So until somebody else defeats Tyson Fury, I can't move him down in the rankings. He's still right underneath Alexander Usyk. Now, of course, number 1, the champion, undisputed heavyweight. Actually, he's not undisputed because Daniel Dubois does hold that one belt, the IBF belt, I believe. But Alexander Usyk holds all the other belts. He's defended them twice versus Tyson Fury. There's really no question that Usyk is at the top of the heavyweight food chain at the moment. I think his performance, particularly his second performance versus Fury, showed us how masterful Usyk really is, because in spite of the 2 changes, I would say, that Fury tried to make in that fight, they simply didn't phase Usyk at all. The first difference being, of course, that Tyson just chose to come in much heavier, 40 pounds heavier, and then do what I thought he would do in my first breakdown of their matchup, which is I thought Fury would use his weight advantage to drape himself over Usyk. However, Usyk was very adept in sort of grappling his way out of Fury's trying to tie him up or simply avoiding it in the first place. The second adaptation that Usyk did so masterfully was just deal with Tyson Fury's sort of newfound jab. If you remember in their first matchup, for whatever reason, Fury fought with his lead hand down, which allowed Usyk to just close distance with his feet, not even having to worry about getting past the jab. However, even though Fury had the height and the reach and started to use the jab in the rematch, it didn't faze Usyk at all. He's used his sort of Eastern European training with that jab hand, lefty versus righty, to simply nullify Fury's jab, which is perhaps part of the reason why Fury abandoned that jab in the second half of the fight. Now, I'm going to double back to those two sort of fighters that maybe shouldn't be in the top 10, which are AJ at number 4 and Joe Joyce at number 10. So who could possibly fill those slots? Well, if we get AJ out of there, everybody else moves up, so we have 2 slots at the bottom, and we could bring a number of folks into the conversation. So, for example, how about Dillian Whyte or Fabio Wardley? Both men. Some folks are going to say Dillian Whyte doesn't deserve to be in the top 10, but he's an interesting character, I think, and he always comes to fight. So, there's a potential there, right? Also, Fabio Wardley, absolutely devastating in his rematch versus Fraser Clark. Again, some may argue that Fabio Wardley, of course, he is the British heavyweight champion, but, he came up through this sort of alternative route of white-collar boxing. Is that fair for him to be in the top 10 rankings? Well, let's see. Let's have Fabio, maybe step up his game a little bit. Maybe he can work his way into the top 10 in that number 10 slot sometime in 24. If he just maintains and steps up his game versus his opposition, it's a possibility. Also, I think here's another name that could perhaps make it into the top 10, which is Justice Hunt. I think he's from Australia, correct? That's, let's see who he takes on in 24. Maybe he can work his way up into the top 10 rankings. Another fellow that hasn't really done enough yet, but I think has some potential, is the American, the silver medalist, Torres Jr. He's 12-0, but he hasn't taken on any sort of viable heavyweight competition yet. So I would like him to step it up in terms of who he fights, and maybe he can make his way into the top 10 in 25. In 25. So far, he's got 12 fights against hand-picked opponents. It's, once you've gotten more than 10 fights of those hand-picked opponents, I don't want to call them bums, but we'll call them hand-picked opponents, and you're getting most of them out of there early, you need to pick up your game so you can go the distance. You want to be able to do an 8-10 rounder against somebody who's viable opposition, so you can learn and you can test yourself and build up the confidence to know that you can go a 10 or a 12 rounder versus a real contender and become a contender yourself. So I'd like to see more from Richard Torres Jr. in 25. Now, also worth mentioning, because they're still ranked in the top 20, Luis Ortiz out of Cuba, and also Frank Sanchez out of Cuba. Now, both of these fellows are a little bit older and didn't have perhaps the greatest performances recently, but I feel that with that sort of Cuban instilled work ethic, they're still viable and could possibly work their way into that number 10 slot, depending on who they fight and whether they can get a decisive victory. Now, one person and one other heavyweight fighter worth mentioning that I don't feel deserves to be in the top 10 is Filip Hrgović. And it's not only because he got stopped by Daniel Dubois, it's because he looked so disinterested in that fight. Just take a look at the last few rounds of that fight. There's something really off about Hrgović, so it's kind of like, hey, if you don't want to be here, then there's plenty of other fighters who want to be here in the top 10 or top 15, top 20. So, Hrgović, if you're no longer interested, then don't let the door hit you on the way out type thing. But there you have it. I'll run through my top 10 again. I have Usyk 1, Fury, Dubois, AJ, Joseph Parker, Zhilei Zhang, Martin Bakole, Ajit Kabayel, Derek Chisora, and finally Joe Joyce. So Who is in your top 10 heavyweights? Which heavyweight fights do you look forward to seeing in 25? I look forward to hearing from you in the comments. Thank you for listening.